Hello and welcome. I am Gohar Raza and you are watching Eureka. One of the problems that the evolutionary scientists have been facing is to know why certain animals live in a colony. Today we have a guest, a very special guest, whose paper has been celebrated by 135 scientists across the world. Welcome, Dr. Kadakar, to Rajya Sabha channel. We are very thankful that you could spare time from very busy schedule of yours. Let's go back to memory lanes of your childhood. Your father was a pilot in Air Force and he was always transferred from one place to another place. That disrupted your life, or you recall as a joy that was perpetual, continuous when you were a child?
But it was an absolute joy, partly because I didn't have to go through formal schooling for quite late in life. Moving from one place to another was fun, but I think the more important component was that I did not have formal schooling for much longer than most people have the luxury of having that. And that gave me an opportunity to dream and think and roam and look at nature and develop my own ideas. And I must say I also absolutely enjoyed the rigors of formal education. I have no doubt about that. I thoroughly enjoy, even now I enjoy very rigorous kind of work. But one has to combine rigorous work with dreaming. Neither of them by themselves is sufficient. You have to dream and you also do things very rigorously. And I think this head start that I got for dreaming, followed by more than usual rigorous work, because I had lost some years and I had to make up those years. So there was an extraordinary rigor. So these two combined have sort of, I think, stood me very well for the rest of my life.
Now, when you were in IIC, then your interest towards looking at the animal behavior had to be compromised at that time, and you were pushed, in fact, almost to molecular biology. Did you feel uneasy with molecular biology?
Not quite. In fact, what happened was that when I was doing my BSc honors and MSc, I fell in love with two subjects: animal behavior and molecular biology.
But before that, you were also in love with Hindi literature.
Yes, of course, yes. And I still think that these compartments are meaningless. There is no reason why you cannot be interested in Hindi literature as well as in evolutionary biology. But I actually fell in love with these two subjects, inspired by some books that I read. And I was equally interested in both of these. And I would have gone in for, and those days it was unthinkable to combine these two. And Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore is arguably the best place in India to do scientific research. It certainly was then, and it is, I think, still one of the very best places in India to do. And they had then just started a program on molecular biology on an experimental basis, and they had only one position in that. And I won that position, and I was very, very happy. And they had no position, they had no program in animal behavior. So all I did was,
Had there been a program, what would you
I
choose between?
I would have done what even I do today. I would take one of them as formal and the other as hobby. Doesn't matter which one is what. So I took the molecular biology as my formal education and I continued animal behavior as my hobby. Today, of course, I do the reverse.
Right. Why did you choose wasp as subject or of your research? Because there are also other animals which live in colonies. And why were you attracted towards this colony behavior? It was a very recent thing that people started writing about it in 60s.
That was quite an interesting accident. In the college where I did my BSc honors and MSc, it's a nice, very nice old building, not very different from the buildings here. And it turned out that in almost every window in the corridor, every window, there was a colony of a particular wasp. At that time, I didn't know much about it, but to watch them was absolutely fascinating. See, a colony consists of 20, 30 individuals. They're all busy working. There are young ones they feed, they take care of. Sometimes they fight with each other. They go and come back. You can watch them for hours and hours and hours, never get bored. We continue to do that, I and my students, till today. So I was watching them just out of fascination. And then I discovered that in fact that species perhaps holds the key to the evolution of social life in animals. And this I discovered later on. And I said, what better than to start studying this in greater detail.
Most of us keep watching environment around us, but very few of us make it as a career, the problem that comes to our mind. I have to take a break. Don't go anywhere. We'll come back. Welcome back. We were discussing your contribution and your interest in WASP. When you observed as a student that there were many colonies of wasps around you, did you realize that this is going to be your destiny and this is going to be that you will work on and contribute significantly?
Not at all. I watch them for fun, and I think scientists should watch things for fun and leave it to fate as to what comes out of it. That is then the best way of doing science. If you start off by saying, I'm going to make an important contribution, that's not the way to go. Scientists should enjoy, in fact, I think everybody should enjoy what they're doing. I am sure you enjoy conducting interviews for television programs. I enjoy watching WASP. I enjoy teaching students. We must do what we are passionate about, enjoy. And then some things turn out to be much more important than others, but that should not be our concern in the beginning.
What was the problem, scientific problem, that caught your attention and ignited your creativity and it was unleashed suddenly?
So when I began to look at the literature about social insects, then I began to realize that there is actually a fundamental paradox which was recognized by none other than Charles Darwin. In fact, Charles Darwin said in his book that the social insects, in fact the workers of the honeybees, might in fact annihilate his whole theory. And there is a paradox there. And he gave some solution to that paradox, but I don't think even today we have a final solution. The paradox is very straightforward. Natural selection, we all know it as survival of the fittest. And what is fittest? The one who has the largest number of offspring. So we would expect that animals, plants, microbes would be designed by natural selection to reproduce as fast as possible, and those that
in large numbers,
and as fast as possible, so that in course of time the fast reproducers will remain and the slow reproducers will disappear. Now in the ants and honeybees and wasps, you have this peculiar phenomenon that a large part of the population basically does not reproduce and helps one or a small number of queens or kings to reproduce. Yeah.
Instead of reproduction, they
no,
are assigned some other job.
Yes, but instead of reproduction, that's the main thing. They do not reproduce, but they simply help someone else to reproduce. On the face of it, this should be eliminated by natural selection because they are not reproducing. So it is indeed a paradox. And as I said, even today we don't have a final resolution, but it is always paradoxes that catch my attention. If a problem is solved, it's not interesting anymore. If a problem is not solved,
either you have something which is mundane, as Feynman has said, or a problem that is unsolved.
Right. So once I knew that there is an unsolved problem, then I really said, this is what I should work on.
So how did you come to the conclusion, and how much time did it take you to come to the conclusion that what was being said, you could build on that and propose a new theory?
Scientists should observe nature and they should also have a theory. You can't have if you only have a theory and don't corroborate with reality, then the theory is of no use. If you only look at nature and don't have a theoretical foundation to peg all your findings, then that's not also science. You need to combine these two. So I went to the theory. It turns out in the 1960s, a new theory had emerged which might potentially provide a solution to this paradox. And the basic tenet of that theory is that producing children is not the only way of having fitness. It's not that is a direct way, but there is also an indirect way, and that is by helping your close relatives, because close relatives also carry copies of your genes. I share half my genes with my son, but half with my brother. So, helping close relatives is an indirect way of achieving the same evolutionary goal as having more children. And
Which
the
is fascinating.
and the
Very
question
fascinating.
is that what these so-called workers are doing? That is the basic idea of the theory, which I found absolutely fascinating.
And therefore, the relatedness of the gene was entered into your equation.
That's right. Except that relatedness alone is not sufficient, because when an individual behaves altruistically, that is, lowers its own direct reproduction and helps somebody else's direct reproduction, there is a cost it pays in terms of not having so many more children. And the benefit is received by somebody else. I pay the cost, you get the benefit.
Correct.
And I do not share all my genes with you. So, the benefit I give to you must be corrected for the fact that you are not me. So, there is a cost term and a benefit term and a relatedness term, and there is an equation, more precisely an inequality, which has these three parameters. Now, what is being done, was being done even now today, is people are focusing on the relatedness almost exclusively or too much, and not focusing enough on the benefit and cost. There is an interesting reason for this. The relatedness is easy to measure. The benefit and cost are not easy to measure empirically.
It's
So, we
very
said
difficult.
whatever is difficult, that's what we want to do. So, we measure relatedness, but we have spent decades trying to get at the measures of the costs and the benefits.
That is fine, but what intrigues me a lot is that nature is experimenting with the colonies, the social groups at one level, but most of the species do not opt for it, including human beings. Human beings are social animal today, but they were not at one point of time, and such big colonies were never built in past. Today we have. So, why is nature experimenting with the two? Why not one single experiment that it should conduct with all animals?
See, in nature, wherever there is a vacuum, it gets filled. So, nature will never have a pure strategy, because if everybody is following one strategy, then simply because everybody is following one strategy, there is vacancy in the other strategy. Nature simply fills any vacuum that is present. Consider a situation where there are animals who are living, feeding, reproducing, they are doing very well. Now, there is an opportunity for another animal to say, I will be a parasite on you, I will live inside your body and I will steal your resources. That is open, so you have the evolution of parasites. Now, if everybody decides I will be a parasite, then there won't be any hosts. So, if everybody is a host, then there is advantage in being a parasite. That is how the balance of nature is achieved. There is any gap will automatically be filled. If there is a flower, then there is a bee which says, I can exploit this flower because I can take your pollen and eat it instead of, but accidentally I also transfer some of that to another flower. So, all gaps get filled, and that is why we have so much diversity in life.
So, diversity is the hallmark of the nature, and then it keeps on experimenting with various kinds of things all through. Don't go anywhere, I have to take a break. We'll come back. Welcome back, Dr. Kadakkar. I'm very intrigued. You are a scientist and a first-rate scientist of the country. You lead a large group which is looking at evolutionary biology. You are also trying to demolish the partitions that are there between various disciplines of science and also science and social science. You are president of INSA today, and you are occupying a chair which has been occupied by the best of the mind that this country has produced in the last century. And you look at science policy of the country very keenly. How do you manage to do all this in such a short period of time? There are 24 hours in your life.
I don't think the number of hours matter. What matters is how you combine these things. So there really are four parts of my life. One part is my research, where I enjoy looking at the walls, interacting with young students, discussing, planning experiments, analyzing data, and reading the literature. That's one part of life which I absolutely enjoy. But the second part of my life is I like to teach young students. So I spend a lot of my time teaching undergraduates, teaching first year undergraduates, actually helping them to design and perform experiments and write research papers even in the first semester of their undergraduate program. And I spend a lot of time doing that. And through that I learn a great deal. The students are very, very good teachers. Teachers should learn.
Always challenge you,
absolutely. So
especially
that's
in
the second
science.
part of my life. The third part of my life consists of looking at how we do science, not just in India but worldwide. How scientists work, how they behave, how they should do, especially in India, how do we do this? What is the best way to organize our science? What is the best way to make use of the limited resources that we have? So that's something that interests me very much, and I have always talked about that, and I like to keep discussing that. That's something I'm very interested in. In particular, I should say that what a country like India should be doing is not simply climbing on existing fashions, on bandwagons which are originate in the West and be defined as also ran. That's not what we should be doing. We should look for gaps. We should look for areas in which the better endowed countries and scientists are not interested in, and see whether we can make fundamental contributions to those areas. There are many interesting scientific problems peculiar to our country. There may be problems of disease which are peculiar to the country. There may be a problem about plants and animals which are present only in our country. They may be related to the way we do our education. So we must look for those gaps. Just as nature looks at gaps and fills them, we should find gaps and we should make fundamental contributions in those. Today it may not be fashionable. I always say that don't start doing something that's already fashionable. Find an area that is not fashionable today and try to make it fashionable tomorrow. That is what we should be doing in India. The fourth part of my life is in fact to break the boundaries between science and society in general, and scientists and people in the social science and humanities in particular. Today worldwide we have created in the academia, in the intellectual world, we have compartmentalized so much that we are not able to understand each other. We are not able to speak to each other. And human nature being what it is, if I don't understand you, then you must be wrong, is the attitude that people have. It is our ignorance that makes us hold the other party in less respect. So I think this understanding is very important, and I am trying to do this in an experimental basis at the Indian Science Bangalore. We bring to the campus the best minds in history, philosophy, psychology, law, literature, art, cinema, poetry, and actual engaged discussions between these scholars and young scientists. And the focus of this discussion is not on the content of these disciplines. The content is not so important, on the methodology. So it is the methodological foundations of these different disciplines that should be the thread that binds all of us together. You should be interested in knowing, how do I know that, I tell you, you take this medicine, it will work. How do I know? I should be interested in asking a historian, you say this is what happened 5,000 years ago. How do you know? So it is that we are trying to do at the Indians.
It is basically the gap, cultural gap that C.P. Snow talked about between science and arts long back, that you are trying to fill the gap there and bridge
that
the
gap has grown, if anything.
Of course, yes, it has grown, especially in the last 30 years, it has grown a lot. I would like to ask you that now India is at another turning point. In 60s and 70s and 80s, we were saying that we are ahead of China and we will progress like China progresses. China has tripled its expenditure on research, especially scientific research and technological development. In our country, it has stagnated. How do you look as a president of the most prestigious organization in the country, of scientists in the country, at the future of science in the
Frankly, the situation is quite alarming. The gap between us and the developed world and also in China is constantly growing. You know, we have
which is
to keep
more worrying than the
Yes.
gap itself.
We have to keep running to stay in the same place. Okay. And that gap is growing. And unless we step up our investment, we will never be able to even narrow that gap. And my worry is that in recent times, that gap is increasing even more because investments in science and technology are actually falling. They have to increase. So we have to find ways of, but I want to add that it is not, investment is not the only thing that is required. What we need in this country is a kind of respect for science, respect for scholarship. I think scientists would value social respect even more than money. And
Absolutely.
that respect is
There's no scientist worth his salt who has worked for money ever. Scientists work to crack the problems that excite them.
right.
Therefore, money is not the only incentive. They do require equipment, they do require a lab, they do require institutions, but they don't require really the money for themselves. It is the respect in the country that will boost the moral. I absolutely agree with you. But how do we increase it? When we were very poor as a country, then we tightened our belt and created the fascinating institutions across the country. Today, do you think that we have been sliding back a little bit on that front? We are unable to attract the best of the mind in these institutions?
Actually, in the last 10-15 years, we have done reasonably well. We have to keep up that momentum. In the last 10-15 years, we have opened a number of new institutions. We have actually attracted back to the country some of the very best people who were abroad. We have to keep up that momentum. We should not let that momentum fall. I think we have done quite well in the last decade or so, and we must keep up that momentum. But as I was saying earlier, it is very important that we have that respect. And of course, we need investment. We need much more investment than we have been doing in the past. That, of course, depends on so many other circumstances, many other needs of the country. But if we have this recognition that this activity is important, then I think we will be able to channel much
Is
greater
Eureka
investment.
program going to help in that?
I would imagine that we need many such programs. When I say respect for science, you can't command respect, you can't order respect. We need to spread the message of science to the society at large. And again, one mistake people often make here, spread the message of science means they say spread the content of science. No, spread the philosophy of science, spread the methodology of science. That is what we need to spread. Not so, you don't have to tell people how many new species I have discovered, but what is a species? Why is it important to define a species? These are the ways we must spread. And once the society understands the philosophy of science and the method of science, then I think they will automatically gain a respect for science.
Your work, scientific work especially, has been recognized throughout the world, and you've been given so many awards. I can't even list them all. Which one do you remember the most?
Actually, I think we should not work towards awards. Whenever somebody says, I want to nominate you for award, I never say no, but I never ask anybody. If it doesn't come, there's no problem. If it comes, I'm very happy. But that is a minor component. See, the way I look at it is, I do my work, and recognizing is somebody else's work. So I
Were you
wouldn't
excited when
particularly,
you got one of these awards?
yeah. So I wouldn't write. I mean, I don't savor and, but
It's a difficult
but
question.
I can answer your question. There was one award which stands out throughout my life as the one that excited me most. In fact, it excited me most because when I heard about it, I tripped and fell down. This happened to me when I was a pre-university student in Bangalore. I just learned that I had been given the National Science Talent Search Scholarship. To this day, the excitement that that news gave to me has remained unparalleled.
Would you like to give a message to the younger generation in the end?
There is no distinction between work and play. You must, when you play, you must incorporate work. When you work, you must incorporate play. That will change everything. This is a message to students, this is a message to teachers.
Play and work. Demolish the strong wall between the two and you will enjoy life. That is the message we take back home. May I, on your behalf, promise our viewers that you will be happy to answer questions or welcome comments?
Absolutely. I would always look for opportunities to interact. I would be very happy to be challenged, to be asked questions. I'm always happy to interact with the public.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful discussion with you. You've given so much of time to Rajya Sabha channel.
Thank you for the opportunity. I enjoyed speaking to you and through you to your audience.
Write to us if you have any comments or a question. Our email address is eureka@rstv@gmail.com. We'll come back next week. Till then, goodbye.